sure you've all heard the story about the four blind men who were introduced to an elephant. And the first man walked up to the elephant and felt the trunk. And he said, "Oh, an elephant is like a snake." The second one came to the elephant and found the ear and felt the ear. "Ah, the elephant is like a big leathery piece of paper." The third blind man discovered the leg and thought, "No, an elephant is like a tree." The fourth blind man said, "I don't know what you guys are getting that idea from." He felt the tail and said, "An elephant is like a rope." When it comes to faith, there are many different aspects for it, and you can look at it from different angles and get different ideas of what faith is. And tonight I'm only going to cover some, and if I miss out on something that you think is an important aspect of faith, that's because I can't do the whole elephant tonight. There's also the riddle, which again I'm sure most of you have heard. How do you eat an elephant? One mouthful at a time. And tonight, the subject being what it is, we're only going to get through a very few mouthfuls. We hear regularly about the conflict between science and faith, and about the conflict between faith and reason. We also hear people referred to as people of faith, both by themselves and by others. And the implication often is that such people have lived with a certain disconnect with the real universe, as though faith and reality are mutually exclusive concepts. So what does all this mean? Does it make any sense? Is faith reasonable? If so, why? Or is it foolishness? More to the point, what exactly is faith? We can't really answer that question unless we decide what faith is. Is faith believing in something because of the evidence or despite the evidence? And if in the end we decide that faith is reasonable, of course, there's also the question, which faith is reasonable? Earlier this year, I ran into a very interesting website or article on the internet. This is from Gizmodo, and it's entitled "Meet North Korea's Bizarre English Language Social Media Strike Force." And if you can find this article online and you read through it, it's about this man and the group that he is with. They are not Koreans in any shape or form, they're Europeans. I think this man is officially Spanish. But his purpose and their purpose in life is to promote North Korea in the English-speaking world and to improve its image and to deal with this perception that we have of North Korea as being a repressive, unpleasant regime and not a very nice place to live. But there's a very interesting comment partway down. He describes how he views himself as a soldier of Kim Jong-il. So this interview was done in 2012 under the previous leader. And how he was drawn to the DPK when he'd heard that it defeated American imperialism. He loves North Korea, he explains, because it reflects his faith. So even atheists can be people of faith. According to Mark Twain, faith is believing something you know ain't true. Or Richard Dawkins says that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of, lack of evidence. Or Christopher Hitchens, faith is the surrender of the mind. It is the surrender of reason. It's the surrender of the only thing that makes us different from other mammals. Now, there are actually people who believe this definition of faith and consider it a virtue to cling to and uphold this faith. But if that is what faith is, then no amount of dressing it up will make it reasonable, and it should be renounced by all. When I was at university, I'd go along to my mathematics lectures, and you get to a point where in the lecture they were describing some great development in mathematics, and the lecturer would talk about the great mathematician who had discovered this or developed this branch of maths, and he'd say, "So-and-so was a really great mathematician. It's such a pity he wasted so much of his life doing science." Sometime later, I'd be in my physics lectures, and we'd be looking at some breakthrough in physics, and the lecturer there would explain how that came about and talked about the great scientist who had developed this breakthrough, and said, "So-and-so was a great scientist. It's a pity he spent so much of his life on mathematics," talking about the same person in each case. And once I'd gone through this a few times with different people on each occasion being referred to, I started to take notice and got a little bit amused. But it is my contention that science and mathematics are compatible. There is no conflict between science and maths. They simply answer different questions. They have different purposes. Science and maths work together to provide a bigger and more accurate picture of what is. In fact, without mathematics, science would be very limited in what it could tell us. Mathematics provides the framework in which science exists and works. Science alone is far from being the be-all and end-all. Similarly, faith is essential for science. I must have faith in the teachers who taught me science and in the reliability and trustworthiness of other scientists. I must have faith in my ability to understand what I am being taught. I must have faith in the validity of my observations and that of others, and in the veracity of my senses and my reasoning to correctly interpret my observations, and similarly in the veracity of the senses and reasoning ability of others. I must have faith in the consistency of the universe, and I must have faith in ever so much more before I can even begin to do science. The conflict of faith and reason, or faith and science, cannot be resolved because no such conflict exists. The conflict is manufactured, it is not real. And as with many other issues, the enemies of reason and truth attempt to bolster their position and create conflict by redefining words. And too often we fall for it. We then end up fighting on their turf, in their terms, in an indefensible position with indefensible arguments. We must first expose this subterfuge and reclaim the words and restore the true meanings. Now, a problem here is that very often there is an element of truth in these redefinitions, but it is a half-truth. And I hope all of you are very much aware that half-truths can be more deceptive and more deceiving than outright lies. So, what is this thing we call faith? What is the relationship between faith and the real world we see, hear, and touch? Does faith still have a role in our modern scientific world? And if so, what? Faith, I believe, is a bridge. Maybe like that bridge that Indiana Jones walked over. It is a bridge over uncertainties, over what we can't see. But it must be anchored on both ends, onto solid evidence, onto certainties. Consider the concept of a ring of truth. Some things just feel right. They sound right. And of course, there are some things just feel wrong. Of course, in either case, we can be mistaken, but that's beside the point in this particular case. Some things just seem to have that ring of truth inherent in them, as if there is an inner witness in us confirming them, even in the absence of sufficient evidence. Some things similarly just sound wrong. And when we reject this inner witness, often for ideological reasons, it leaves us with an inner conflict or tension. Similarly, scientists and mathematicians often choose or promote one theory over another because of its elegance or beauty. Now, I've got nothing against doing that, that's fine, but it's just a fact of how things are done. But all of this goes beyond the mechanical. It is a characteristic of human nature, enabling us to go far beyond what a computer or a robot could do. It enables us to come to valid conclusions with insufficient evidence. It is how we invent things, create music, do science, create movies, come up with ideas. Faith is what enables us to live, to move, to partake of this world. According to C.S. Lewis, faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted, in spite of your changing moods. Or Martin Luther King Jr. Faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. In other words, you see the start of the staircase, but you don't see the end of it. Or Victor Hugo said, faith is a necessity to a man. Woe to him who believes in nothing. Now, there are some people who argue that science, being equivalent to objective truth, and faith, equivalent to subjective nonsense, have no connection at all. And they kind of relate this, I suppose, to the non-overlapping magisteria of Stephen Jay Gould. That was the idea that certain things can be perfectly valid in their own context, but not in a different context. So, for example, it is perfectly valid to discuss elves and the lives and the actions of elves if we're talking about Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and that sort of thing. But if we're talking about science in the real world, then it's not valid. It doesn't go in that area. And so we have totally separate realms in which we can validly discuss things, but there's little or no connection between them. And in that context, Gould would see faith as being perfectly valid subject to discuss in its own area, but having no connection to reality. The general belief is that faith is unreasonable, that it is contrary to reason. And there is much ridicule based on this notion with references to, for example, sky fairies and invisible friends and the like. There are others, however, who do their best to show that science and faith are compatible, that it is possible to be a person of faith and a scientist at the same time. Very often, however, these people tend to go along with Gould and have distinct science and faith compartments in their minds, and never the twain shall meet, with apologies to Mark. And it seems to me, again, that the biggest problem in this whole debate is our understanding of what exactly faith is, especially given some of those quotes I mentioned before from Twain, Dawkins and Hitchens. And one of the aims of a group like this is to demonstrate that faith is reasonable. True faith, real faith, is and must be based on reason, on evidence, irrespective of whether or not that faith is rightly placed. It's based on past experience, faith in a trustworthy teacher and a witness, and so on. Or, just moving around the elephant a little bit here and looking at it from a slightly different angle. We can consider this diagram here and faith as kind of being a line. On one extreme end, we have negative certainty. On the other extreme end, we have positive certainty. And on any given subject, my position is going to be somewhere in between. And the gap between where I am and positive certainty, we call faith. The gap between where I am and negative certainty, we can call doubt. No matter how sure something is, there is always this gap. There might be a particular subject where I'm all the way up here, or all the way down the other end. Nevertheless, we can never quite get to be absolutely certain about anything. In fact, this diagram should probably be asymptotic. So the further you go, the closer you get, but you'll never actually get there. And so there's always this room for faith or for doubt in whatever our subject is. In fact, probably the closest we can get to certainty about anything is, I think, therefore I am. Now, depending on your worldview, you would pick different positions along this line for different questions. But again, note that certainty is not necessarily the same thing as truth. It's just absolute certainty on the subject. They may or may not correspond. Information, data, facts don't compete with faith or with doubt. Rather, they serve to move the pointer along the line. They do not provide certainty, merely probability. Moving around the elephant a little bit further, come into another aspect completely, but still relevant to faith. When I was married, I promised my wife to be faithful to her. She likewise promised to be faithful to me. I have faith in her. And the longer I live with her, the better I know her, and the stronger my faith, the more faith I have in her. Of course, for some relationships, the longer you live with someone, the better you know them, the less faith you have in them. I suppose that again is moving along the line of faith. And the marriage vow includes a vow of faithfulness until death, as unfashionable as this vow has become these days. It's still often put in there anyway. If someone is faithful, then I can reliably put my faith in him or her. According to Libba Bray, you can never really know someone completely. That's why it's the most terrifying thing in the world, really. Taking someone on faith, hoping they'll take you on faith too. It's such a precarious balance. It's a wonder we do it at all. And yet, back to an earlier part of the elephant. I hope you all like the elephants. As any scientist will tell you, or anyone at all in fact, we don't know everything. In science, there is much that is unknown. In fact, the more we know, the more that reveals that we don't know. Stuart Firestein was the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences at Columbia University, and he wrote, I have a small snippet of his quote there, "Being a scientist requires having faith in uncertainty, finding pleasure in mystery, and learning to cultivate doubt. There is no surer way to screw up an experiment than to be certain of its outcome." Science, then, is not like the onion in the often used analogy of stripping away layer after layer to get some core, central, fundamental truth. Rather, it is like the magic well. No matter how many buckets of water you remove, there's always another one to be had. Or even better, it's like the widening ripples on the surface of a pond, the ever-larger circumference, in touch with more and more of what's outside the circle, the unknown. This growing forefront is where science occurs. It is a mistake to bob around in the circle of facts instead of riding the wave to the great expanse lying outside the circle. Perhaps the most important application of ignorance is in the sphere of education, particularly of scientists. We must ask ourselves how we should educate scientists in the age of Google and whatever will supersede it. The business model of our universities, in place now for nearly 1,000 years, will need to be revised. Instead of a system where the collection of facts is an end, where knowledge is equated with accumulation, where ignorance is rarely discussed, we will have to provide the wiki-raised student with a taste of and for boundaries. The edge of the widening circle of ignorance, how the data, which are not unimportant, frames the unknown. We must teach students how to think in questions, how to manage ignorance. W.B. Yeats admonished that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. It is a standard belief of science that those things we don't know, we can know. We can work out. For example, we don't know how life formed from non-life, but someday we will. This is simply believed by faith, based on evidence of what we have discovered and determined in the past. It is a leap of faith that the unknown is knowable and can be known and will be known. Once upon a time, man believed in spontaneous generation. That is, that life could and did spontaneously form from non-living matter. For example, rotting meat naturally produced maggots, or piles of dirty rags naturally produced mice. This has since been proven to be false, and all the evidence we have tells us that life only comes from life. That non-living matter never becomes life, never becomes living, although of course the opposite occurs quite regularly. There is no known mechanism whereby life can form from non-life, and the best efforts of scientists have been unable to even come close to making it happen, under the best conditions they can engineer. So those who believe that the universe created itself from nothing, who believe in the non-existence, or at the very least the total non-involvement of God, had to take a giant leap of faith to believe that something all scientific evidence says is impossible actually happened. That someday science will work it out. That eventually our best minds and scientific approaches will be able to replicate it, so proving that no intelligence was required in the first place. Where there is complete knowledge and absolute control, faith vanishes. Where knowledge and/or control are incomplete, faith must be exercised to bridge the gap. Faith in my senses, faith in my reasoning ability, faith in my teachers, faith in other people, faith in my memory, faith in Wikipedia, faith in horoscopes, faith in God. We are all people of faith. Without complete knowledge and absolute control, it is impossible to live without faith. So, what basis do we have for faith in our reasoning, in the reasoning and veracity of others, in our senses? In a universe that somehow created itself from nothing, if everything that is the result of unplanned, undirected, undesigned, purposeless, random actions, reactions and interactions, then that applies also to the human brain. There is thus no basis whatsoever for believing that any of the thoughts, deliberations, conclusions have any meaning at all, or any connection to reality. Therefore, if you believe that that's how the universe came to be, you have no basis to believe it. No basis for reason, for rationality. No basis even to believe that you actually believe what you think you believe. To believe that chemical reactions and the movements of electrons can provide us with rational, coherent, valid, conscious understanding of reality requires a giant leap of unjustified faith. Computers cannot do this. They are merely machines, only able to do what we tell them to. Their output is only as good as our input. And they did not randomly evolve as we are believed to have done, but are the result of countless hours of intelligent design and construction. However, everything that is came into being at the behest of an intelligent, relational, and that's a very important word, purposeful creator, directed according to his design. Then that applies also to the human mind. On that basis, there is an absolute basis for believing that our thoughts, observations, and reasonings do have genuine meaning and validity. Therefore, if you believe that that is how we came into being, you do have a genuine basis for reasoning, for rationality, for believing that this belief is rational and meaningful. Thus, irrespective of the actual nature of reality, this doesn't prove one way or the other how it actually happened, irrespective of the actual nature of reality, it is only belief in a created God that can be considered a rational belief. No other belief can be maintained on any reasonable basis whatsoever. And in fact, it is because of things like this that modern science could only develop in Christian Europe, because only there was the necessary faith in human reason. Now, God is often derided as God of the gaps. When we don't have an explanation for something, we say, God did it. But as science takes us further and further, those gaps get smaller and fewer. And as I was intimating before, based on past experience of how far we've come, it is feasible to look ahead and imagine that one day down the track, all those gaps will disappear, leaving no room for God. And God will then cease to exist. But Christians don't see things that way. To them, science isn't removing God, but revealing him. Faith can be viewed in a similar way. Faith covers the gaps in our knowledge, based on some of the things I was saying earlier. As knowledge increases, it leaves less room for faith. But a universe, an existence with no room for faith, is one not worth having. For that would require absolute knowledge and absolute control. This would then totally rule out any possibility of genuine, meaningful relationship. For example, you'd be left with a unitary God, incapable of creation or of anything. It is relationships that provide worth, meaning, and purpose, that provide life. And in any relationship worth having, each party is free to give and take as they choose. It is not love, it is not real, if one has absolute control and the other is a robot. Hence, there will always be the requirement of faith. Faith in the faithfulness of the other or others. Faith is thus also vulnerability, as Libba Bray pointed out earlier. Placing trust in one who may let you down and trusting that they won't. Being aware that it is always a possibility, though in the same way that science reveals God, the more, the better we know someone, the easier it is to have faith in his or her faithfulness. So in conclusion, faith is an inescapable essential. Faith is as much, if not more so, faith in a person or persons than belief in propositions. Ultimately, the big question when it comes to faith is, well, which faith is reasonable? We could also consider which faith is the most reasonable. And an important consideration in deciding this is to determine which is the most consistent, which is most coherent. It is my thesis, which I have alluded to tonight, that the Christian faith best fits these criteria and is by far the most reasonable. This group is called reasonable faith because we have come to believe that to be the case. And by looking honestly at the evidence to show that it is so, and to also come to better understand areas where we may have misconceptions and to further enlighten our faith.
The definition I like of faith is that faith is essentially trust. And so you actually, an example would be, you can learn all about parachutes and convince yourself that a parachute would allow you to safely land on the ground. But faith's the actual act of jumping out and backing your beliefs. I really detest the idea that faith is believing something without evidence. But sometimes some of the scriptures, it kind of makes you wonder. Like there's the passage that last week that Peter Wilcock quoted about Thomas, and he said, unless I put my fingers in his hands and in his side, I won't believe. And then he saw it, he says, my Lord, my God, and Jesus says, blessed are those who have not seen yet believe. So the way Peter interpreted that was to say that blessed are the people who believe without evidence. Now, obviously, we wouldn't interpret it like just because they didn't see didn't mean. We don't see doesn't mean that we have no evidence. So I really do detest the idea of believing without evidence. I can't see any merit in it at all. But there are some passages in the Bible that may actually tempt you to think that way.
That was where one of the points I made in my conclusion comes in, that faith is very often not so much a belief in propositions, but in people. So the faith isn't in the idea, the faith is in the veracity of the people who you're telling it. You trust these people to be telling you the truth, to know what they're talking about. Yeah.
Some people a man came to Jesus and Jesus says, don't doubt, just believe. So it kind of sounds as just believe, as though not hanging on a lot, as though there's some merit in just believing. But all right, so you're saying that it's exercising your faith in the person of Jesus. Like, given all his background, you should be able to trust him.
Yes. And of course, in the records of other people that are reporting what he said and did and those sorts of things, and the veracity of all the various bits and pieces, that we have faith in those that we believe in all of that.
Is a faith a noun, verb, or what?
Noun.
I think it's...
Faith is a noun.
Can be both, can't it?
Have faith is a verb. Faith by itself is a noun.
But like the Greek word that's normally kind of to have faith is istio, and it means to trust.
But the word pistis is the noun.
So it can be both.
Well, faith comes in for quite a deal of scrutiny and definitions and the rest of it, but one of the other bits that needs analysing, I think, is the word reason. And I bring that up because a couple of years ago I was looking at this in the age of reason and all the rest of it, and the way they used reason as a weapon and a flag and such like. What I found when I went through the Bar Smith Library was that half the English language dictionaries of philosophy had no entry for reason. Half of those that did said see reasoning, and the quarter that had a go at defining reason actually defined reasoning or talked about reasoning. Now, what is actually being contrasted when you talk about faith versus reason? What's the reason?
Good question. Like all these books on philosophy you're talking about, I assumed it.
Well, it's a basis, isn't it?
But it needs to be analysed at least as much as faith, because one of C.S. Lewis's arguments is about faith in reason, and you have to ask the question, where did people get faith in reason? And C.S. Lewis's point was that if you think we got here by a purposeful creator, then you can trust reason. But if you think we got here by a blind chance process with no purpose or value, then you have no logical basis for trusting reason.
That was one of my points.
Yeah.
I presume if you want a definition of reason, it's actually deductive logic, isn't it?
Yeah, logic.
Well, that's reasoning. Reason is what gets contrasted with faith. So what is being contrasted?
I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's really an operation of our minds, and I suspect that the humans have reasoning, but so do some animals, and it's perhaps the similarity between all our minds that we accept each other's reasoning up to a certain point. I saw a thing on, it was a program talking about physics and quantum physics. And they had a blackboard and the scientist was going through with the maths of it. And he said, there you are. And he turned to his students and said, now what do you think of that? And his student was a single dog sitting there. And he said something I thought was profound. He said, dogs have no idea. They don't understand physics because their brains are not made for that. They don't have the brain for it. So in my view, reasoning is something to do with the commonality of our brains. And it's probably no more valid than anything else, except that we accept it amongst ourselves.
Yep, but that's talking about reasoning. It's not faith versus reasoning. It's faith versus reason.
Faithing.
What is meant by reason?
I get your point, but are we, to a certain extent, splitting hairs with that?
Oh no.
I'd say reason is our capability to do logical deductions.
And that we all agree on that.
Yeah.
That
And quite often we say there is or you're saying that it's arbitrary, it's just something we agree
It's arbitrary, but we agree on it because of the way our brains are. A dog would not agree on it, but we would never know, of course.
The dog wouldn't understand it, that's all.
No, but the dog would understand dog reasoning or something of that sort. He would have his own sort of thing in his brain because he has a particular type of brain.
But you're saying that reason is a human construction and it doesn't have an independent reality.
I reckon I might.
Sorry?
I would accept that. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it, but that's basically what it is. It's to do with our brain. But then that comes on with what Ron was saying about near the end there about reality and understanding. It's all to do with our brain, and the whole thing is to do with the brain. Because I assume an amoeba doesn't have any faith whatsoever, and he had have very little reason. But he is definitely alive in that he reproduces himself. So
Or she?
Or she, or it.
Yeah.
So getting down to nitty gritty, that's where we're coming from, I think. And our whole world is in our brains. We construct that. When we see something, that something doesn't go into our brain. It's broken down to electrical signals which go to our brain, and our brain assembles it, and it keeps doing that. But through a bad word evolution, those whose brains didn't relate in some way to what's going on around them, they died out, they were killed. Because they didn't fit in with the reality.
So why do we still have dogs?
Because their abilities...
Because they're cute.
Right, because they're cute. Well, because they bred them from wolves, didn't they? So they are cute, that's why they bred them.
Because they reason in a different way. Because dogs reason in a different way.
Well, maybe, I don't know, but I don't know what it's like to be a dog, but maybe a dog doesn't survive because of his reasoning ability. He may survive because of his teeth and because of his aggression and because of that sort of thing. Whereas we have to interact with each other and we have to work with each other, and so we need to be able to see, I can see you looking around here, something ready to jump. And so we can actually interpret other people's signals. And we can actually put ourselves in their mind as to what they might be thinking. We may be right, we may be wrong, but that's what we do.
I'm generally wrong.
Chimpanzees have been shown to be able to do that. They can tell your motive.
But like to say that it's just a human construction, like there's some fundamental rules of logic. One of them called modus ponens, one of the fundamental ones, is that if P implies Q, then if P is true, then Q must be true. So if it is raining, there must be clouds. It is raining, therefore there are clouds. All right? So would you say that's a human construction, or that's something that is true, independent of whether any human thought of it?
I think it's a human construction. What we're able to manipulate that and imagine it, and make something of it.
Oh, yeah, we worked out the law, but the law is there.
We've just described what is.
Yeah.
We describe, I'm sort of flying by the seat of my pants here, we describe what enabled us to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Other human beings or other animals may describe something quite different, and it didn't help them to survive, so they're dead. They died out. And only those who had some of that reasoning to even just a tiny ability survived as they went through.
But what is it that makes you think that you are actually thinking what you think you were thinking?
I don't know, but I believe I know where it is. It happens in your brain. It happens in your brain, and it manipulates all those things that you have experienced in life, and it puts them all together and gives you that impression that you know what you're thinking. But we are, I believe, I'm getting off the track here, but I believe that we are machines. We are animals. We have no free will. That's another imagination.
So
But
you
we
were
are
meant
extremely-
to think what you just thought.
We are extremely complex. So it seems to us, you know, if you go up, walk along the fence and brrr with a stick and the dog's over there, you bark. Every time you go past, you bark. You do the same thing. But the owner will get a bucket of water next time and throw over your head because he is responding the same way. He just is more complex. And he figured he can remember this business, and he said, well, I won't do that anymore. I'll send over a bucket of water, see what happens. But it's still reacting to external stimuli. That's what it is. And internal. But they have been developed by
So you're denying consciousness?
No,
Ultimately?
no, he may not be.
Consciousness.
You're denying free will, aren't you? So you're just saying that we're a machine, and so if you could, and so we're a bunch of chemicals, and banging into each other, and the outcome is determined. So really, we don't have free will.
Well, we're produced by our DNA, aren't we, in embryology. It puts the proteins together in such a way that it ends up as their good self. You break one of these little chains and you end up with something quite different.
Mm.
And so that's what it is. And all of those chemicals they work on the laws of physics that we think we understand. They work on the laws of physics, and so we.
But isn't, I mean, all of those, that's not contrary to there being a creator. I mean, you're just describing what is, and so much of us is chemistry. But that's, if you're coming from a created worldview, to say, well, that's because that's how we've been made. You know, we're made from the dust, whatever. We're very complicated dust.
Intelligent design.
What
We're
I'm
very
saying,
complicated dust.
I'm saying faith is within our own minds. And our reason is within our own minds. It's just that we have similar brains and we accept similar situations. People who didn't accept those, or certain people who didn't accept them, died out because they fell down the hole, they shook hands with a saber-toothed tiger or something that was in their brains. A lot of people died because of, what was that, the teddy bear, you know. They go over in America to give a big bear a hug because in their mind they got the idea of a teddy bear and a lovely, fluffy thing. That's what they believe. Their mind believes that. Then when they go out and act on that, they get killed because the bear is different to them. So that's the end of their genes, that's the end of their experience in the world. Others won't do that. They will react differently to the bear and survive on, and we're the progeny of that.
One of my points was that if that is how everything came to be, and that is an accurate description of what is, then we have absolutely no basis to place any confidence in our ability to determine that.
Except that it's survived. No, except that we do believe we're here, we do believe we survive, and therefore we take some confidence in our abilities.
How do you know that you're not just some disembodied mind imagining all of this?
You can't do it. You can't go, you could be. But then you're just making that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas I believe that this physical thing here there is something there.
Yeah, but you've got to have a reason to believe that.
Yeah. Well, because I've got a brain which is telling me that. But what it is may be quite different to what I think it is.
Mm.
That's what I'm saying. But my thinking of it has grown up over a very long period of time of people or individuals who don't think like that, dying out.
Yeah.
And gradually we have evolved to be closer and closer to reality. We may be miles away from it, but we're close enough to survive. So we don't go around hugging grizzly bears, because we know what's going to happen.
So you're saying the ability to reason has survival value.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was discussing similar things with a guy at work who studies the brain, and I said, like, do you kind of believe that our brains are ultimately deterministic? You know, it's just a result of chemical reactions and things moving around. He said, yes. And he said, doesn't that kind of undermine your actual ability to think? Because everything is determined, so where's the true thought? And doesn't it undermine your responsibility and your freedom of choice? He says, yes. He says, at the end of it, ultimately, I'm quite happy to accept that I'm a zombie.
Well, it's been put this way, I don't know, that it's put this way, that when we say we were machines, a lot of people think of, or robots, a lot of people think of the clunky old robots of the old days, and we're not like that whatsoever. We're more like, and we're not like exactly a computer, but we're more like a computer, or it's been put as a heat-seeking missile, you know, you fire that off and it chases an aircraft.
Yeah.
A primitive people, a person from, not necessarily primitive, but from a different background, who hasn't seen this before and has no idea about machines, would think that that thing's alive, because it's acting like it's alive, it's acting as if it's intelligent. Well, we're like that, except way more complex than any of that. But we're so complex we can't even imagine that, you know, that we think we have free will. But there's some experiments which have been done which suggest that that's not the case. That our mind, perhaps our subconscious mind, makes a decision about things, and then the conscious mind is informed a bit later on, 6 seconds later.
So the definition of libertarian free will is that if you actually put a person in a given set of circumstances, is it possible that he makes more than one choice? And the answer would be yes, if you believed in libertarian free will. But if you didn't, you'd say no. That if you put him in a particular set of circumstances, only one choice that he can make. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wonder what the point was.
The question is, do we actually have libertarian free will or not? And the definition of libertarian free will is if you put a person in a given set of circumstances, only one choice is possible. He's not capable of multiple choices.
That I wouldn't know.
Well, that's just a definition.
We would be confused, as the gentleman's shirt considers we're confused, because we might have more than one possibility swirling around in our mind, but eventually we'll click on the one, and that clicking on the one has got nothing to do with free anything, it's to do with the way our brain's been made up.
Yeah.
Paul talked about like a metaphor for us as being like jars of clay, you know. So yes, we are just our chemistry and our, you know, DNA and all that stuff. That is the jar of clay, right? But we have life that's been poured into us temporarily from God. So we do actually have life, even though yes, a lot of what you're saying is true about us as physical, as a physical invention, as an you know, as a bare animal type, you know, minus that life principle.
See, this is where I have been thinking about that, and I have a bit of a problem with it, is that I don't think there is such a thing as life in that sense. Because when we say God poured something into us, I think what we're really thinking of is we have a consciousness, self-consciousness. And that's what we often think of as life, because for what the things you were saying. But a dog's alive, I mean, an amoeba's alive, it reproduces itself, it has offspring, but I'm sure that we don't think it has a great deal in terms of consciousness. It doesn't have this sort of magic thing. All it does is its molecules can reproduce and produce another one. And that's what life basically is. That's how you would define life as basically is.
Well, that's all part of the jar of clay, I would say.
Yeah.
All of that stuff is part of the jar of clay. It's not the life itself. There is matter, and then there is life, which animates matter.
Yeah. Oh.
So when somebody dies, it still looks like it's all there, but this person's
But the life is gone, and they're just matter. That's just matter now. Because that whatever it is, that, I mean, and you know, obviously we're a Christian group, most of us therefore have a view that fits in with a particular range of this, but you don't even have to stay within the Christian worldview to see like this, you know, you could talk in terms of chi or whatever, that there is matter, and then there is this animating principle.
It's matter going through doing what matter does, that produces, well, as far as I understand, the beginning of there was something like molecules that could reproduce themselves just by chemical reaction. That A plus B gives you C, and when C can break apart and give you A plus B and reproduce itself over and over again.
But does that ring true? Like you live within your own experience, right? In your own brain or whatever. Don't you sense that there is more to yourself?
I don't want to keep going on this because it's a bit privacy.
Sorry. Sorry.
But no,
you don't feel
I
like
do,
that,
but I reject.
I can understand the argument. Like you could easily define life as a complicated function,
Something
and then at some point it breaks down and it ceases to function, and the whole thing the motor stops, doesn't it? Like you have a motor that's running for a while until something breaks and it no longer works.
The body stops, and then it no longer functions, and those things that we think of life are no longer.
Yeah, he's got me convinced. Thanks.
But we've wandered off the topic of faith. Like, are we all in agreement that kind of faith is? A classic example is the book of Hebrews chapter 11.
It's a chapter on faith. And you've got this hall of fame of all these famous people, and it's commending their faith. But the thing about it is it's actually commending them for what they did. And so I can't think of all many of the examples.
I think you're wandering around to the other side of the elephant.
What chapter is it?
Chapter 11.
Back of it.
Yeah, but it's, if you like to read out bits of it, it might reveal I'm totally wrong. But that because they believe things, they kind of took the risk, so to speak, and did incredible things. And so one of the definitions I have of faith is acting on what you believe to be true.
Again, in this case, their faith was in a person, not in the propositions, so therefore they did based on their faith in the person.
Yeah, certainly that's a strong element of it, that it's you have faith in God for some reason. But like if you look like...
Do you want me to read out?
I'll start from verse 1.
Verse 1. Just now my voice backs up. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous, when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him for the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he is and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised, they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. But instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
So, you know, what do you get from that in terms of the essential elements of faith?
Actually got an interesting picture of
Trust.
that from a more modern perspective. There are people in the world who do not like the country they're living in, and they have faith that this distant country called Australia is a much better place, and they are prepared to embark on crowded, dangerous boats and travel halfway across the world, across the ocean, in very dangerous circumstances to get to this place they've heard about.
Yeah.
And I guess we've heard about God and heaven, and we take some pretty dangerous boats getting there too.
It's got elements of some sort of
Faith
risk.
has got a lot to do with trust.
Mm.
You trust that what you've heard, what you've been shown is right, and you're willing to step out because you've believed what somebody or something has told you.
Mm. Yeah, like everybody, you made the point that like everybody has faith of some sort, but it says in there, without faith it's impossible to please God. So it's talking
there's a
about
particular
a particular
person.
type. Yeah.
The particular faith that is important is to believe that God is, that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.